Hello and welcome back to the free online woodworking school. In this video, we're going to begin sizing and laying out the drawer for this shaker table. So in part one of this build, we've already established what the drawer front's going to be, and that is continuous grain from the left and the right-hand side of this shaker table. We have just got to take a bit off the top and bottom to make sure it fits within this cavity. And then we've also got this lovely bit of curly maple, which we're going to turn into the drawer sides and back. First, we need to get this all sized, and we're going to start with the drawer front. So if we want continuous grain going around the side here, I know the leg's going to block it somewhat, but it should still be somewhat noticeable. We need to take material off the top and the bottom of the drawer front. Not the most economical way of doing it. It would make sense to make it biased towards the top or bottom and take off more material from here, so we've got a bigger offcut to use later. But if we're being pedantic, which we are, we're going to need to take it off the top and bottom. So I can feel the drawer runner is flush with both sides in the place that it's due to go. So I'll just set a marking gauge to 14 millimeters, and we'll scribe that along the top and the bottom of the drawer. That way we can rough cut to these lines using whatever method necessary. Maybe it's by hand. I'm personally going to do it on the bandsaw, and we'll end up with a perfectly central drawer front with a little bit of excess material on either side that we can plane down in the next step. So let's get this cut. Okay, and next we've got the length to cut down. There's actually a bit of a defect here, so I'm going to slice off that side, and that way we'll be left with some really nice straight grain on this drawer front. And again, we'll cut this slightly oversized. Perfect. So it's just slightly too big to fit in all directions, so we can refine that back with a plane now. So we've been left with a piece of wood that is now rough sawn on all four faces. So the first thing we're going to do is establish a face side and a face edge. This is the front of the drawer. This is going to be the bottom. We'll add letters later to sort of designate where the joints are going, but this will do for the time being because we're sizing this first. And now every process we do when squaring up all these edges is going to be referenced off of this face edge. But to begin with, we need to clean it up and make it flat. Now, if you're feeling confident with a plane, you could just put this up in a vise and plane it straight and square, just like that. And honestly, if you've got this far in the project and you've done all of those leg tapers by hand, you should be able to do that. But there is a lazy way of doing it, which is by using a long grain shooting board. I'm going to use my split top bench for this. All you need is a flat base. I've got a nice bit of plywood for this, a slightly raised platform, and then a backstop. Just then clamp it all together. It doesn't actually need to be square or anything. Literally all it is a platform for your plane to go on, a raised platform for the piece of wood to go on, and a backstop to stop it from shooting off. Then, with a really light cut, you can just go along, flatten the piece of wood, and assuming your plane is square on the side, you can take advantage of it and plane this straight and square. And there we go. There is our face edge. We'll just draw that mark on again so we've got it. So now it's all straight and square, and it can be used as a reference to square off these sides and make the top parallel. So we're going to start by squaring up the sides on a end grain shooting board. And the reason for this face edge is that whenever we're squaring off a side, we always make sure that face edge is pushed against the fence. So if I wanted to plane this one and I do this, that is technically wrong, because if this side isn't parallel to this one, it could be doing something like this, and we can end up with a square edge here, a square edge in this corner, but this one and this one is not. Whereas if you square off the edge like that and then flip it over end to end, so the face edge is still pushing against the fence, that way, as long as your shooting board is square, you can make sure that both of those edges are square to the bottom edge. So we'll shoot down both of those sides evenly, and at this stage, we're going to aim for a really snug fit in the front of this. Once the drawer is kind of all assembled and we've done the cleanup and everything, that should loosen it up enough to get a nice smooth fit, but for now, we're going for something reasonably snug. Pretty good. So it just about wedges in there, but holds itself really nicely. And so now with the bottom and side square, all we've got to do is get the top plane down to fit. To do this, I would recommend measuring the height of the cavity. So it's pretty much 70 millimeters, and we'll measure it in a few places just to make sure we've got an accurate reading. So yeah, 70 mil. And then we'll set a marking gauge to 70 millimeters, because we can use this to mark a parallel line from the face edge and give us something definite to plane back to. So with the marking gauge pushed against the face edge, we can just do a few light passes to scribe a line along the top, Be careful when you do this because marking gauge slips can cause pretty bad cuts. It's better to clamp it down, but I'm just using really light pressure for this. You could also do it on the back if you wanted. If you're going to plane this side down in the vise without the use of a shooting board, it might be helpful to have a line on either side to work to. But that should give you a nice parallel line along the top there to plane back to. The reason we've done this line is because without it, it would be very easy to accidentally plane a taper on this and end up with a wide end and a thin end on it. This line just makes sure it's a uniform distance all the way along. And so I'm actually just going to do this in my normal shooting board because it's got the capacity, but if not, you can use that shooting board I just showed you. And you want to be checking this periodically. So we're not quite there, that side. That side is just about going in, so we'll take a bit more off the other side. So that fits really nice and snug in there now. And yeah, I mean, as a grain match, that's pretty cool. The thing I liked about this particular bit of walnut is this sort of light band that goes through the middle. So now it goes all the way around and matches on this side as well. So with the drawer front done, next we're going to start focusing on the drawer sides. And clearly when we're sizing these, we want to maximize the amount of space within this table for storage. There we go. But generally it's a bad idea to use the back side of the table as a stop for the drawer. And so when we size these sides, I'm probably going to leave 10 millimeters at the back and then create a stop for the drawer on this front edge. I'll explain how we do that later, but the problem with using the back is that you've got to get it bang on. Because if you slightly oversize it and you put the drawer in and it hits the back, then all of a sudden the front's sticking out and you're stuck with it. You've got a drawer that's glued together. We're also going to be doing lapped dovetails on the front. And so we need to take a bit of material off the front here in order to account for that as well. Unless, of course, you want to do through dovetails, in which case these sides will need to be measured all the way to this front edge because you're going to see the end grain on the drawer front. But I prefer the look of lapped dovetails on drawers. So it's currently at 230, taking off 220 for the back. We'll take off another 3, so 217. Is going to be the length of our sides. And so again, we'll cut these oversized and then sort of shoot them down to length. And we've also got to take a tiny bit off the height in order to make it fit in this cavity as well. And so we're pretty much going to be repeating the process we did on the drawer front. Establish a face edge on the bottom of the components, square off the sides, then thickness down the top to fit. So we'll just get a face edge established on these first. So I reckon that's the outside of the drawer, that's the bottom, and then on this other one, that's the outside of the drawer, that is the bottom. So a couple of skims on the bottom first to get it straight and square. Okay, so we've got 2 face edges. We'll just square up one edge. And then using that squared edge as a reference, what do we say, 217. Actually, I need to do it this side because we're going to be flipping this around when planing it. 217, 217, and we'll square back to them. And we'll just get them together and make sure they are the same length. So they don't need to be 217 bang on. That length of 10 millimeters at the back was sort of arbitrary. What matters is they are the same length. And then once again, we'll use the marking gauge set from the face edge to establish a line at 70 millimeters that we can then plane back to. I'm actually going to do it with this shooting board again. The higher cutting angle in this blade is not causing as much tear out as the low angle on my shooting plane. And so this is the beauty of these adjustable drawer runners we did in the last episodes. So the drawer sides should go in nicely, and because we've planed them down back to a marking gauge line, we know that these are parallel top to bottom. So make sure you get your face sides correct. In this case, they're on the bottom. That slots in, and we just loosen these drawer runners, which will give us all the movement that we accounted for in them. And we can push that down on the top of the drawer side. Not too hard, you know, just sort of holding it in position. Tighten it up again, and now that top runner is perfectly parallel to the bottom one, And if we can get this drawer side out, it's going to give us a really nice parallel cavity to now fit the drawer into. So now at this point, it's probably worth labeling each corner of the drawer so we know where the joints are going. So that's the left one. That is the right one. And we're not going to worry about the back of the drawer just yet. We'll get that sized after we've cut all the joinery, so that will be in the next episode. For now, we're going to do A, B, and contrasting A and B. So then this would technically be C, and that would be D. And that will correspond with the back in a minute. So next we're going to start marking out the lapped dovetails. The first thing to figure out is how far we want the tails to be nested into the front of the drawer. So with this being the front of the drawer, I've already kind of established I want a 3mm lap on the front. So we'll measure in 3mm from the front. Just put a little mark there. Set the gauge up from the back face to match that line, and then scratch a line along the end grain. I wouldn't make this too deep because it can be quite difficult to remove later, unless you want to keep the marking gauge lines, that is. We'll do the same on the other side. And then we need to do the same on the tails to indicate how far in they're going to be nested. So with that same setting, make sure you're marking it on the fronts. We need to go along the sides on this. We need to go along the back. Now I'd actually recommend making this back one quite deep, so we can use this to our advantage later. And then the other side. Same again on component B, relatively shallow on the front, and then pretty prominent on the sides, very deep on the back, and then the sides. So that will give you a shoulder line on the sides of the drawer that should match the depth on the front of the drawer. So now we're going to use a marking gauge to dictate how deep we want these drawer sides to go into the drawer front. Now we've got to think a few steps ahead with this, because if we sink these in too deep and we leave end grain sitting proud, when you flush the end grain on this front down, that drawer front is going to end up too wobbly. And so when I'm setting this depth, I actually like to set the marking gauge so it leaves the drawer side sitting ever so slightly proud of the front of the drawer. And then that way, when you're flushing these joints down, the drawer front doesn't change dimension, you're just bringing the sides down ever so slightly to fit. And when I say sticking proud, I mean like, again, a hair's thickness. It's the smallest amount needed to make sure that it's long grain sitting proud and not the end grain of the drawer front. To do this, all you've got to do is set the marking gauge slightly below the thickness of the drawer side. So the drawer side is sticking proud above the cutter. And again, I'd make this enough just to sort of catch your nail on it, because we don't want to be planing down so much of this that we end up drastically changing the thickness of the drawer side. And so now on the back of the drawer front, that's where we're going to scribe that setting from either side. And again, we can make this pretty deep if you want. One there, one there. And hopefully you can see here that if we line the drawer side up with that marking gauge line, we end up with a tiny bit here that we can plane away. Now, before we move on to marking out the dovetails, keep that gauge setting because we're going to need it for the back of the drawer when it comes to marking the shoulders out on that. Obviously, we haven't actually cut it to size yet. So keep that marking gauge in a safe place. And next we will start marking out the tails. So to mark out the spacing on this, I'm just going to stack them together in the vise. Make sure the bottoms are sitting flush with one another. And to be honest, the spacing of this is up to you. I'm going to go 4mm in from either side, and then we'll do a 4mm pin in the middle. And then I'm going to go 1 in 6 dovetails. Mark the waist. I'll do the same on this other side. And that is our front tails marked out. And the back is always the one that gets a little bit confusing. This is the outside face of the drawer, this is the bottom. When we fit the side, I've got a sample piece here. We want to have a step on the bottom and a step on the top. The reason for that is on the top, generally we've got a little angle on there that gives us a bit of a leading edge to put the drawer into the cavity. And there's usually a little flat spot below that just to make sure it's not too much of a fragile edge. So angle and then very small flat spot. On the bottom, what we have is a groove. This is where the bottom of the drawer is going to slide in. And the nice thing about this construction is even when the drawer is fully assembled, the drawer bottom can still slide in under this back. And what's more, we can even fix the bottom of the drawer into the underside of the back to give it some extra support. One thing you've got to be really careful of with this is the size of this groove, because this groove is not only going to be running on the inside of the drawer sides, but it's also going to be running on the inside of the front of the drawer. The thing you've got to watch out for is that this groove goes all the way through, and on the ends we've got a joint there. And so if you put the groove in the wrong location, you might end up seeing it next to the lap dovetail. And what we're going to try and do here is hide this groove under a lapsed dovetail. The way you do that is by ensuring that the bottom of the groove is no lower than the bottom of the tail on the front. If this groove goes all the way down here, let's say, what's going to happen when we route the front is this section that will be walnut end grain will end up with a little square cut out of it there. It looks horrible when that happens. And the rest of the groove will be under the tail there. So what we want to do is account for a groove where the bottom of it lands either in line with the bottom of this tail, or preferably even slightly in from it, sort of around about there. You have got to be careful with this because obviously the further up you go, you're losing height in the inside of the drawer. So it's a bit of a balancing act. And so what I'd advise doing is just measure this distance on your tails and then add 1 millimeter to it. So for me, to the bottom of the tails, it's 7 millimeters. And so with this groove, the bottom of it needs to be at minimum 7 millimeters, but to make it safe, we'll make it 8. Then of course the groove has some thickness to it. I'll probably do 6 millimeters. So that gives us 14. That should be the size of the groove. 8 millimeters from the bottom, 6 millimeters in height. From there, we're going to have a square wall across. So I'll just do that with this. And we're going to have a square line down. There's no baseline yet. We'll get that on later. Next, we'll go from the top. So that'll give us 5. Square that across, square it down the front. And now this distance, which for me is 52 millimeters, is going to be the width of the drawback because it's going to need to slot between those marks. Of course, we need some joinery in there. So the way to do that is 52 millimeters. Half of that is 26. We'll make that a 4 millimeter pin in the middle. So mark 4 millimeters either side. And then with these two edges, they're technically going to be half pins. So we'll mark 4 millimeters from there and 4 from there. And then simply turn those into dovetails. Scribble out the waist, and that is how you mark out the joints for the back. And as for the length of the back, that is going to be exactly the same as the drawer front. So let's go get that material cut now. So again, same process as before. Figure out a outside face, face edge, and then use that to square up the ends. Go. That is the exact length of the drawer front. And now, because the back is the same length as the drawer front, we can use that marking gauge we put aside earlier to mark in from either side and make it the exact same width as the lines we've got on the back of the drawer front. If you did accidentally unlock it, just reset it to the front of the drawer, but preferably it hasn't moved. And with these back ones, you shouldn't have to mark out the edges. You just got to do the faces. Now you'll notice we're doing this without having thickness the piece down from top to bottom. Still got a rough sawn edge on the top here. That is intentional. We'll actually plane that down to fit after we've sort of cut these joints, because hopefully you can see with that going sort of in there somewhere, all we've got to do is take down the top of this a little bit to fit under that sort of top line here. Very easy to do later on. And so now we can reset the gauge to mark the line down these back tails that I didn't do earlier. For that, the gauge gets set to the actual thickness of the back. We don't need to leave a lip on this or anything. This can be set completely flush. And the nice thing about having drawn out all these tails is all you've got to do is scratch between those lines. Then we won't have any marking gauge lines to remove here at the back. So that's the front face. The back just go all the way along. And then finally, we'll just make sure that everything is correctly numbered. Face, sides and edges are oriented correctly. So that makes this one C and D. So face sides are on the outside, face edges are on the bottoms. That is going to make a really nice drawer, I reckon. So in the next episode, we are going to begin cutting it, fitting it, gluing it. And so thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please don't forget to press the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you then.